Welcome to Beyond Perception. I'm Simon, and my guest today, Professor Thomas Sheenan. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you.
So to introduce you briefly, you are a philosopher, a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Religious Studies, Stanford University, and Professor Emeritus at the Department of Philosophy, Loyola University Chicago. You are known for your books on Heidegger and Roman Catholicism. Your specialties are in philosophy of religion, 20th century European philosophy, and classical metaphysics. Among many, you are the author of Making Sense of Heidegger, a Paradigm Shift. It is my great joy to be here today with you.
My pleasure to be with you, Simon, and with your audience.
Yeah. It's my choice. So I think I shared this with you in our email conversation, but I might just give that as a context. So the work of Heidegger has crossed my path in the last 2 years quite a few times. First, through a conversation on this podcast, my guest making a reference to him. And that led me then to explore his work. And that opened experience beyond, you could say, conceptual thinking. Something came to life, and I had the chair of the Heidegger Foundation, Professor Seibert, a few times here on the podcast. And last year, I was introduced to your work through a friend I met in the Amazon rainforest who had a very beautiful awakening thanks to your book, Making Sense of Heidegger. So I got the book, I reached out to you, and here we are. What I thought might be a great start for our conversation. You wrote extensively about Heidegger. So what called you specifically to dedicate so much time of your work to Heidegger?
Yes, I've been doing this since I was about 19 years old, 18 or 19, when I first read Heidegger in translation. And I think that was back in the time when Heidegger was considered an existentialist, and I was reading Sartre and Kierkegaard and Camus and others like that. So I was fascinated by something about him, which was that philosophy was not an 8-to-5 job. It was dealt with transforming one's life and living a better life. And in that sense, he's in the great tradition of Greek philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy, etc., where life was not simply, philosophy was not simply analyzing one's life, but it was asking, so what do I do with this? Existential wisdom might be one way of saying what I thought I was finding there, and still do, in what he was writing. And so I always, with my students, always say there are two questions in approaching Heidegger: the what question and the so what question. Mm-hmm. And it's the latter that I think is the most important, because Heidegger's main work, Being in Time, is not simply an analysis of human being, but it is an effort to call one to seriously consider transforming one's life. So that was where my interest started, and then it just kept going.
So the question, which is obvious to me, is then, how did dedicating so much time and work to Heidegger transformed your life?
Well, I hope it has. I'm not the best one to judge that, I would say. We'd have to ask my wife and my kids if that has had any effect on me. I always try to conjugate, and it's a difficult conjugation to make, Heidegger, who is very interested in the individual person and his or her life and authenticity. But for me, the effect of that should be as well social. So Heidegger, if I can just use names, Heidegger and Marx have always been the two figures that I've most worked with. Even though most of my publications have been in Marx, much of my teaching have been in Heidegger, much of my teaching has been in Marx. So I'm still interested in whether or not Heidegger can offer us an entree to Marx that would not, for example, have to be the Hegelian philosophical entree that we're most used to. Herbert Marcuse, who was one of Heidegger's students in the late 20s and early 30s, tried to make that transition. And I find his work taking off from Heidegger in terms of movement and history to be fruitful. But that is aspirational. Most of my work is still in Heidegger itself. But I feel that while he's wonderful and insightful on how to live one's own personal life, he's not as insightful about how to live an authentic social life.
So is this the only distinction to other philosophers, science, or metaphysics, or what is special about Heidegger's work and perspective?
I think a lot depends. In order to answer that question, everyone has to answer it for him or herself, but a lot depends on how one approaches the text. His texts are notoriously difficult to read, either in German or in English translations. Someone once said Heidegger should be translated into German before he gets translated into English, from German to German. That is to say, that would be a little bit more understandable. But one has to ask, what do I want from reading this text? That's the so what question, I guess. And the way I approach it is the way I think Heidegger himself approached his own work. So this is a bit of biography, I guess, of Heidegger, at least as I read him. He grew up a very conservative, rural German Catholic, a nationalist, monarchist, etc., and especially a very strict Catholic, and even joined the Jesuits for a while, but because of a heart condition, had to leave very early. And I think that when Heidegger ended up at the university, Freiburg University, in the 1910s, he experienced a deep crisis in his life, out of which comes his work. And I think that approaching it from the point of view of that crisis opens up a perspective on Heidegger that can be, for me at least, very fruitful. He, I think, perhaps in reading Nietzsche, personally experienced the crash and burn, if you will, of the centuries-long, millennia-long metaphysical tradition, whether it's in religion or in philosophy, a perspective that is seeking ultimate stability. The god or gods is the final one that establishes the rules and stability. And only second best is change, time, motion, things that, for example, Plato would always put in second order. The whole thing is to get to the stable, eternal, whatever. Nietzsche, on the other hand, really collapses the sacred canopy, be it metaphysical or religious, that the West, the East, had been living. And I think that really struck Heidegger to the core as a young man. Combining that with the crash and burn of the German Second Reich in the war, the Great War in 1918, Heidegger, as one scholar, William Barrett, has put it, comes out of those experiences sort of like someone crawling out of a bombed-out city and trying to make his way without relying on traditional philosophy or certainly traditional religion. For a while, he was drawn to Protestantism, radical Protestantism. He was married to a Protestant woman, but he starts to move even beyond that. So by going through one's own personal crisis, calling into question the stable frameworks that we have grown up with and hardly recognize, but which shape our lives, by either feeling personally that collapse or asking oneself, what is it built on? One might be able to approach Heidegger the way he himself approached his philosophy. So he insists on a radical experiential base, not what you've learned from your parents or your rabbi or your priest or your teachers, but from what you yourself directly, personally experience.
Mm.
And that's what phenomenology is about. The word phenomenon, or in the plural phenomena, does not refer to things out there in the world, Mount Everest or the European Union or whatever. It refers to the correlation, the connection between the experiencer and what is being experienced. And Heidegger is convinced that that phenomenological or experiential correlation is where philosophy has to begin, where it must always stay, and where it will end up. That is set over against a tendency to objectify the world, to think of it as independent substances out there, which certainly is the case. It was out there before you and I were born. It'll be there after we die. But in human experience, we are not watching things through a store window with no contact with what we see. We're interested, we're involved, we're curious, we ask questions, we want to know what's in it for us, we have practical concerns. Those are what I mean by correlation with things. So he is beyond a subject-object division, which is a necessary way of approaching science, for example. We don't care if the scientist has a bad cold or if her marriage is breaking. We just want to know what's going on in that experiment there objectively. But that's only part of our lives. The way we live our daily lives, and Heidegger thinks we look past this, forget it, etc., is that we are connected with what we experience. That's it. Experience always has an experienced, and it's like looking at a picture in a museum and forgetting that you're the one looking at that picture. And you think the artwork is up there on the wall. No, the artwork is the work that's going on between you and what's up there on the wall. That would be the area that Heidegger wants to work in. I think it was Claude Monet who famously said, I'm not interested in the object that I'm painting. I'm interested in what goes on between me and the object. Use the word motif for object. So for Heidegger, as he starts all over from experience, my first experience, if I'm honest with myself, is not that there's stuff out there. It's rather that there's interesting stuff, meaningful stuff, stuff that I'm curious about, involved in. He even calls it, I'm fallen into it. I'm so absorbed that I forget that I am absorbed. And he wants to bring the experiencer into the discussion, not as a subject over against an object, but as what he calls being in the world, involved in, familiar with, etc. And I think that's, if one approaches his work just by trying to find out, what a philosopher said about human being or reality, one will miss what Nietzsche calls the value for life, right? Of what he's talking about. So it's not that there's stuff out there, it's that there's meaningful stuff out there. And it's not meaningful in and of itself. It's meaningful precisely because of my relationship with it. Before human beings come on the scene, we could say there is no meaning. Yes, animals certainly knew how to deal with things, etc. But human meaning happens only with human beings. That's why he says we are language. We are meaning makers by our very nature. He wants to know why and what the consequences of that are. But I not only am always making sense of things, often wrong sense. Even when I babble on my deathbed, I'm trying to make sense. It may not make any sense to anyone else, but we cannot not be making sense. And He wants to say we're responsible for the sense that we make of the world. Obviously, we are. We can't pass it off on to the government or religion or everything else. I am responsible for it. I usually don't assume that responsibility, but that's part of what the book is about, to call one to responsibility. He calls it authenticity. I'm not sure that's a good translation of the word. Well, in the Greek, authentes means the person who's responsible for a murder. I did it with my own hand, so I'm the authentes of that murder. Um, if we think of it in those terms of responsibility, I think the word has more meaning. But anyway, just to start off, as I say, how we approach him is perhaps critical to how we're going to end up reading him. If you read him as just a philosopher with interesting ideas, then you've missed the point. He wants to insist, no, I want to thrust you into your experience, ask you what obliges you to make sense of things, and then to take responsibility for it. That's a general introduction, if you will, to how, when I think, that's the way I try to get my students to read Heidegger. You know, you can read Kant, Schelling, everybody, and just find out what they said. You can read a history of philosophy and do that, but it won't do much for your life.
And it seems that he is led by the question of why being at all. Is that his means of taking the reader, us, into this self-exploration or this interconnected experience?
He does ask that question. Why are there things rather than nothing? That's Leibniz's question, but he doesn't mean who put all that stuff out there or how did it get out there. He's not asking a creation question. He's not asking an evolution question. Whenever he says things, one must always add the adjective meaningful things. And as soon as you say meaningful, the question comes up, meaningful to whom and meaningful in what way? Because the way Donald Trump experiences the world is different from the way other people experience the world, let us say. So when he says, why is there being, let me say this much. The word being in Heidegger is very slippery, and he has two distinct meanings for that word, which he doesn't always clarify. And therefore, the scholarship has been misled in large measure. In Being in Times, outside his major work, I think, being means not the isness of things. The tree is out there. The dog is in the house. Is means is meaningful. We cannot avoid that. We forget it all the time, but we are invested in every time we say is. So I would rather bracket the word being, which sounds so abstract and vague and diffuse, and I would rather say meaningfulness. So his question, why is there being at all, is not asking about why things are out there. It's asking, why am I obliged to make sense of things? How come I can't get away from it? Well, you can by dying, but short of that, in whatever state you're in, even dreaming, you're making sense. It may not be the correct sense, and it's certainly never the ultimate sense, but you are making sense. So why is that the case? This is a pretty fundamental question. The Greeks would have said, you know, what is being? Heidegger, as a phenomenologist approaching from experiences, would not say what is being, but what is meaning? How does it get there? How am I involved with it? And why can I not do it? So it's all about the significance of things to you. One way of, I just said that the word being or is means is meaningful to. Another way of putting it would be, and this is crucial, I think, to his way of reading things, is means matters. So it matters to me that stuff is out. Maybe not existentially importantly matters to me, but of course it matters to me that the building is standing up and not crushing down. Everything matters to me. And he wants to find out, what's that mattering being about? So being is always related to the human being, if I could put it that way. Or thrown into it would be his word, geworfen.
So what
And that,
another, pardon.
you asked the question before in our email, what's this have to do with language? Everything. But by language, Heidegger doesn't mean the meaningful sounds that we utter with our throat and our tongue and our lips and so on. By language, he means what the Greeks called logos, the ability to speak. And the ability to speak is based on the need to make sense. That's why I speak. I was just with my grandchild. My wife and I were with the grandchild, and children speak because they need to make sense of things. So underneath language as blah, 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 spoken words, is the human being as the meaning maker who cannot not make sense. Good sense, bad sense, or indifferent. Anyway, excuse me, I interrupted you. I think you were about to ask another question.
Yeah, it's very interesting how you put a perspective on him. Would that be a right way to try to describe it, as that no matter what, like what or how we're experiencing what is, it is always through some kind of subjective lens of meaning, that there's a filter between what is and me, the observer, which no matter what I do, I can't escape.
Right. Yes, and he would rather that we not use the word subject, because subject is always paired with object, and then there's a difference between, a gap between them.
Mm-hmm.
So he would use, I'm now paraphrasing, he would say, you're not a subject, you're an eject. That's pretty strange, but that's what existence means. Sistere in Latin, or histemi in Greek, means to be made to stand, and then you add the prefix ex. We are thrown into being outside. We are thrown into being ahead of ourselves. Both of those phrases, outside and ahead, are crucial. So when Heidegger says Dasein, which gets translated as, it could be translated as existence, it's often mistranslated in English as being there, which makes no sense at all. The tree is there, but that's not what he's talking about, right? He means you are cast into making sense of things, which means, this is important, why do you make sense? You make sense because you are needy, imperfect, you don't have it all together. Therefore, you have to be moving forward into the world, metabolizing things, bringing them into your sphere. I don't mean metabolizing as eating, but we are already bound with things, but fundamentally, we are ahead of ourselves with the purpose of surviving. And in order to survive, to continue to keep on keeping on, we have to bring into our needy selves all of the people and things that we encounter. In 1971, I spent an afternoon with Heidegger and Freiburg, and he had invited me through my teacher, and he asked me to submit some questions, which were, of course, very naive. I was right out of graduate school. And as we sat in his home, in his second floor office, he said, if you really, he kind of put my questions aside, and he said, if you really want to understand what I'm doing, you have to understand two things. You have to understand what Husserl says about meaning, Logical Investigations, volume 2, investigation 6. And you have to understand movement in Aristotle, kinesis. So meaning and movement. We've just been talking about how everything is meaningful because I make sense of it. But why do I make sense of it? For Heidegger, relying on Aristotle, but changing him. The human being is, as he puts it, the Urbewegung, the most fundamental form of movement, not the movement of things rolling down the hill or of automobiles going down the road. No, we are a movement ahead because we are finite, needy, and need things, need people, right? So that if we use the word sense in two senses, it comes from the Latin sentire. Sentire has something to do with making cognitive or practical sense of things. But when, for example, you're in Paris and the street sign says sens unique, sens comes from sentire. Or if you're in Rome and the street sign says senso unico, it doesn't mean one, it means one direction. So sense has this double meaning of movement, direction, and making sense, making meaning. So movement and meaning, we make sense because we are thrown into movement as finite beings that need things in order to survive and need people in order to survive. So for Heidegger, that's why I'm using the word eject instead of subject, a word that he would prefer that we not use. We are ejected. It's not our choice. We're always already out there in the world making sense of things because we are making sense in the sense of, as he puts it, alles ist Weg. Everything is in movement and it's on its way. And then you die. Now, that last part, and then you die, is utterly crucial to Heidegger's reading of life, right? Mortality. So it seems like we're ending up with what I tell my students, the 3 or 4 M words, meaning, because I'm in movement, but that movement is mortal. That's what basically being in time is setting up. Now, that may sound dark and despairing and tragic, but for Heidegger, the fact that we are mortal, not just that we're going to die up ahead, but that we're right now able to die. Sein zum Tode is usually translated as being towards death. But that means, hey, I'm not dead yet. That isn't what it means. The zum can mean at the point of. I am at the point of death at every moment of my life. So Heidegger says in Being Time, from the moment you're born, you're able to die. You're ready to die, So if mortality is inhabiting my movement and my meaning, for Heidegger, far from that being something negative, it actually casts you back into, he uses the word, it throws you back into a world of meaning and movement, with the awareness, however, that this isn't forever. And therefore, meaning, because in movement that is mortal, you are cast back into morality, the 4th M, if you will, taking responsibility for a life that is always changing, never stable, a life where movement is your being, and it's going not to a goal that will finally end the movement, the way Dante or would have it, for example, in the Commedia, or Christianity would have it with the afterlife. Maybe there is an afterlife, but he says experientially we know nothing of that. So he's an agnostic, not an atheist. But then when we realize in a moment of insight, Augenblick, he calls it with Kierkegaard, that is the state of play. When we face the music, we're confronted with, what do I do? The question of morality, if you will. And in that regard, I said earlier that Heidegger is, I think, very informative and insightful when it comes to individual authenticity. Morality, however, besides individual authenticity, has to have some sort of social authenticity and responsibility, where Heidegger doesn't go there, or rather, when he did go there in the 1930s, it was not a very good move. We can let that be for a moment. So all he does in Being in Time is talk about the basis of personal morality.
Hmm.
He doesn't use the word morality, but he means authenticity, taking responsibility for my actions when I read them in light of my mortal finitude. That's, in a
Hmm.
sentence, if you will, what Being in Time is about. He calls that Historicity, Geschichtlichkeit. It doesn't mean that I'm just trotting along in time from one year to another. It means I form my own history, my own Geschick,
Hmm.
right? My own Schicksal, because of the choices that I make, which is the basis of morality, if you will. So the
Hmm.
four M's. One way that I
Hmm.
tell my students, and I ask them to not repeat it because it sounds so pedantic and so simple, but it's a way of organizing what
Huh.
he's.
And you mentioned the language Heidegger is using, and it's very difficult to understand. Is that on purpose to use words we are not necessarily used to in order to not automatically associate pre-attached meaning? To question
Good,
the
good
meaning we
point.
are attaching to.
That's a good way of putting it, Simon. I think there's more to it than that, but certainly, and we'd have to ask why this is the case. Certainly in Heidegger, virtually every technical term, seriously technical term that he uses does not have its ordinary German meaning for Heidegger.
Hmm.
The word sein means to be in German, but for him, sein is to be meaningful. So sein is really about Sinn, intelligibility, meaningfulness, and Bedeutung, etc. The word Zeit does not mean the passage of time which you can calculate on your wristwatch or your cell phone or whatever. For him, time, Zeit, is actually Bewegung, the existential Bewegung of a human being. You see, that's very different from time as the measuring of the sun going around in a given day, and so on and so forth. Uh, the word Wahrheit does not mean truth. And he says that explicitly. And yet translators continue to, in English at least, to call it truth. What he means by Wahrheit is making sense of the sense that you make of things, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Whereas we think it's no, the accurate sense when you happen to make
So
that.
is
That's
this
Wahrheit.
a distinction between absolute truth and a relative truth
It,
through giving meaning?
I think he would say all that we have is relative truth, ever expanding. The truth of Newton is not the truth of Einstein, is not the truth of string theory, is not the truth of quantum mechanics. So that we're constantly disclosing, making sense of. Now, again, I mentioned Dante. Well, finally, all of that comes back to God as the source of all truth. So there's an absolute truth, and the promise of traditional Christianity, again, I'll use Dante, is the beatific vision, the visio beatifica. You will see truth face to face. For Heidegger, it's just an ever expanding disclosure that then you pass on to the next generation
Hmm.
because you're gone. So it's not, there's no absolute truth. And in fact, the only absolute is that you cannot not make sense continuously, expansively, and make error as well. Uh, so every term you ask, does he do that just so that he will defamiliarize? It might seem that, but I think there's two other reasons. One is each of these words traditionally comes from a metaphysical context. Being means stable isness. Time means tick tock, etc. Whereas when you put them into a phenomenological experiential thing, time is not just tick tock. Time is a long
Hmm.
time, even though it might be only 2 minutes. It's experiential time, right?
Hmm.
What Augustine calls distentio animi, that is to say that I'm spread out not the way that I can measure it by tick and tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick chronology.
Hmm.
I have a different sense of my movement. I'm very old now, and time goes a lot faster than it did when I was 12 or
Mhm.
20,
Mhm.
30.
Mhm.
This is experience time. It's been the same objective tick and tock for the last 83 years of my life. But no, I experience time differently. That's one reason why these words have different senses. He
Mhm.
puts them in a phenomenological, experiential, rather than an objective, metaphysical context. Second reason is that Heidegger was a Hellenophile. He just admired the Greeks amazingly, and Aristotle and so on. He read Greek every day, ancient Greek. And he felt that a lot of the terms we use in philosophy have lost their contact with the original Greek sense of those words. The poster boy word would be the word Wahrheit, which in Greek would be aletheia. Aletheia. A means not, like apolitical, amoral, the alpha privative, it's called. And lethe means hidden, forgotten, like the river Lethe, where you forget everything. Aletheia doesn't mean I got it right. It means I have stopped it from being hidden. I've brought it into my ken, my perception, and I can make sense of it. That's now I can make good sense, medium sense, bad sense of it. That would be truth or falsehood, if you will. But aletheia, and it's which is what he would say human beings are, is we make sense. We drag things out of their darkness into the light, and then we try to make sense of them. So that's an example of where, only one example, of where he tries to get back to the original Greek meanings in Plato or Aristotle or even in the pre-Socratics and say that in German. But the only language he has is the metaphysical language of Sein und Zeit and Wahrheit and so on. And he does occasionally say, oh, by the way, I didn't mean that in the usual sense. A lot of times he doesn't. And we have to just know that it has a different meaning from context.
Hmm.
But he didn't make it easy for either his readers or even for himself because he's been misread. He would complain all the time. Nobody understands me. Well, guess why? There's a lot going on with the language that he doesn't always tell us about.
And so, from what I'm understanding, being a human being is not to be separated from meaning. It's interrelated. It's so.
Right. If I could, excuse me for interrupting, but if we want to use the being language, which most Heideggerians unfortunately do, we would say human beings and the being of stuff are inseparable.
Hmm.
There is no being in Heidegger's sense, meaning, without a human being. So they are inevitably correlated. Whereas in the metaphysical sense, being was there before human beings, trees, things were out there. There was isness, as it were, out there, and they'll be there after we're gone, right? For Heidegger, no. Being means meaning, therefore it has to have a dative, meaningful to, etc.
So we have no chance to know what is beyond meaning.
That's a great question. Richard Polt talks about that. Heidegger has an image that he calls the clearing in English, the Lichtung in German. Let me try a bad analogy, but it might work. A miner in a coal mine, wears a helmet with a light in front, and that light illuminates what's in front of the miner. It clears the darkness for a little bit of space. And as you move forward, it clears more of the mine. Uh, that clearing for Heidegger is what human being is. It is this sense making light. Sometimes it'll get it wrong, but at least it'll bring it out of the dark and I can see it. I can start to make sense of it. Um, And let's see, I even forget what your question was. I thought I was off on a track there.
I think the question was if we, in that case,
Oh,
don't have
yes,
any chance to look beyond meaning, to know what is beyond the meaning.
exactly. Because there is no is in Heidegger's sense
Hmm.
outside of the purview of a human being. So being increases, can I use that phrase? Meaningfulness grows as we learn and live and learn from literature and science and whatever. But all we can say is that as long as I live, I am that light, shouldering up against a darkness that I can overcome by shining a light there, and another kind of darkness that I can never overcome, which is my death. My mortality is shouldering up against me at all times. So, no, we cannot know what something is without a human being present. When you and I say, for example, well, what about we can talk about the time of dinosaurs when there was no human beings around? What we forget is that we are placing ourselves imaginarily back in the time of dinosaurs, but pretending we're not looking. No, there's no looked at without a looker. There's no meaningful stuff
But
without
that,
some.
I mean, that also implies we can't know who we are. Are you fed up of being paralyzed in a corset of rules and dependencies, seeing no way out because of doubts or senselessness, bumbling along numbly in your job or just toiling away, believing that something is wrong with you, or simply swimming in the conformity soup? In other words, wasting your life waiting around? If that's the case, you came to the right place. The Art of Creating workshop is all about waking up from your trance and revealing without doubt the incredibly creative spirit lying within you, reconnecting with your unique intuition and giving you powerful creative tools that empower you to create your life regardless of the circumstances the way you love it. Big words? Yes. But not even close to the reality and possibility of you. So sign up here now, let yourself be creatively blown away and wake up to the wonder of you.
That's another fabulous point that Heidegger makes, that in order, let's see, if to know something is to be able to objectively know the reasons for it. Aristotle says that, aitian gignoskein in Greek, to know why there is this thing and give reasons for it. If a human being turns the light upon herself, you're presuming the very existence that you're trying to understand. You're moving in a circle. We call that begging the question, right? So in that sense, you cannot know yourself. Let me give an analogy. The eye in your cranium, EYE, cannot see itself, but it can see all sorts of other things. If the eye turned around to look at itself, it would, what would it see? So in a sense, the self, the ego, if you will, is always about something, and it's involved with that. It can know that it's involved with that, but it cannot give a reason for itself. It cannot ground itself, right? So ultimately, as St. Augustine says, the human being is an abyss with no bottom that we could ever see. Homo abyssos, he says, time and yeah. Now, Augustine thought that God could understand the whole of us. But I think part of, I said earlier, Heidegger's crisis is recognizing, facing the music in a sense. Not only can I not know from where I stand now what may lie after death, as we say, I have to be agnostic about that. So even myself, I can know how I function, but I can't know why. I mean, why am I forced to do this? Well, we can say evolution made you do this. Well, who says is
that would be meaning we
yes, exactly.
give it.
So yeah. And, you know, I mean, we live with that all the time. It shouldn't shock us that we don't know everything and everything. And even, I mean, is anyone surprised that they don't know themselves? Just ask your spouse or your partner, and they'll say, you just don't know who you are. Yes, that's true.
There,
In more sense.
there's a sentence I quoted or I have out of the book, and it is the following: we stand in the play of being, even we do not know who we ourselves are. We must understand human being originally and in advance out of its relation to being and out of the essence of being itself.
Whoa. I don't even know how to make sense of that sentence. No, I do actually. But let's see, what did I want to say? There was some important idea that I had there, Simon, that is just slipping me right now. Um, Einstein says brilliantly in 1939, he says, everything in the world is comprehensible except why it's comprehensible. You know, in a certain sense, I can see everything itself. And then let's turn EYE into ego. The I cannot
Hmm.
fully know itself.
So that would imply the following meaning: life is a gift, undeserved. We're just here. There are no obligations, rules, conditions to be met. We are just here.
Well, that's right. There are no prevenient rules set by a supernatural
Mhm.
entity or by nature, et cetera, et cetera. So Heidegger will say, es gibt, it's just a given
Hmm.
that you're
Hmm.
thrown. He'll use that word, geworfen, thrown,
Hmm.
by which he means that no, there's just some stuff that you can't figure out.
Hmm.
And that's the nature of a human being. You want to
Hmm.
be divine or an angel that would know everything? I don't know. Well, it's just not in the cards for you. So finitude, mortality are crucial terms for Heidegger. And I think that was part of the crisis that he went through. Very conservative Catholic as a
Hmm.
young man. And then he starts to read, and he got very interested in evolution when he was in university, and Nietzsche, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
But
Uh,
it seems he still has a suggestion then that there's a purpose for us, even we don't know who we are and why we are here.
right. And again, early on, Simon, I said, that I've repeated, he's very good about the individual self, right?
Hmm.
He's not so good about, he's good about the ego, but not the we, the
Hmm.
I,
Hmm.
but not the we. He does have chapter 4 of Being in Time is about we are inevitably social, but after he says that, he doesn't do anything with it. He
Hmm.
doesn't write a social ontology, for example,
Hmm.
which I think is necessary for a robust ethics. He can only talk about personal authenticity. Um, but um, let's see, to go back to that, now I remember the brilliant thing I was going to say a while ago. Heidegger has a fictitious dialogue uh, called Ankivasie in Greek, uh, and he's pretending to be talking with a companion as they walk along a path, describing what Heidegger thinks about a human being. And at the end of it, his interlocutor says, the more I listen to you, the less I know who I am. And Heidegger's wonderful response is, none of us knows that as soon as we stop fooling ourselves. We would love to be transparent, but we've got a shadow, you know. But back on the other thing, as you say, then we're just here and it's we who make the rules. Now that sounds like, whoa, relativism. Yes, it is relativism. What's the alternative? An absolute truth, which doesn't seem to be available to us. So we're responsible for the rules we've inherited nationally, personally, philosophically from Plato or Aristotle, but we're responsible for it and responsible for what we do with it. So there's where the morality, the ethics dimension opens out, and Heidegger just doesn't take us there.
Is that what he points to as becoming authentically temporal?
One of now I'm going to step into that void that Heidegger,
Mhm.
let's ask the question that he doesn't ask. He actually does ask it in course in 1933, 34, but let's remember that he was involved with the National Socialists at the time. He's trying to make sense of society in, unfortunately, a National Socialist framework. But he does ask, who is a we? Who are we? Now, his answer, of course, is, well, we Germans, not we humanity, right? It's a very blinkered, restricted view of things. But if I were to step into that question, who are we? We're really asking what kind of society, if we are intrinsically social, what kind of society do we want to build? Especially if we're aware that we're all mortal. None of us gets out of this alive, to put it strictly. So we're on a raft and we're never going to get to shore. So what do we do on the raft? Do we eat each other? Do we only let the rich people eat and the poor people don't get as much fish that jump onto the boat? How do we organize a raft when everyone realizes they're mortal? Of course, everyone doesn't realize that they're mortal and therefore wants to have the most toys when they die to pass on to the kids and so on and so forth. Think of all of the psychology that goes into denying mortality, right? So what kind of an economy would one have if Heidegger's propaedeutic to the self were realized? What kind of culture would we have? How would we establish what is true? In the United States, as you know, Simon, now the abortion debate is raging, right? It's become a culture war. Not only abortion, but just about everything societal has become a fight between progressive and conservative, or whatever we want to call them. And some people think that there is an absolute answer to these questions. Whereas, what Habermas would say is, democratically, we make up the kind of society, the economy, the culture that we want to live in without being able to have some deep backup voice out there telling us what is, And again, the responsibility is on us. So it's out of questions like that, I think, that one would begin to ask, and Heidegger doesn't, and it's very complex to be sure, about the social dimension, if we accept that we're all dying and we're all bound together. And so Heidegger was a socialist, but it was a national socialist. What if he'd been a humanitarian? I'm just throwing out terms, but what would be the consequences of that? That's what Marcuse was trying to do with Heidegger's work, for better or worse.
What I'm making of it is through this pointing to our nature or us experiencing. I'm not sure if that's an accurate description, so please correct me. But it would mean to me that recognizing that we ultimately don't know who we are, but we have a shared experience that would highlight our interconnectedness to some degree.
Yeah. That and the planet as
well.
None
of us lives in a vacuum.
Yes. But more and more we try to. at least in America, we have gated communities. We've got the rich at one end, the impoverished at another end, and sort of the twain don't meet. And we have a society built around the accepting that and trying to ameliorate on the edges. Heidegger really wanted to be a revolutionary, but he only was able to, when he tried to become a political revolutionary, or at least serve the revolution of 1933, as he himself eventually admitted, it was a total catastrophe and a failure. And all he does is give you the motive for revolutionizing your own life, but it's never enough just to change yourself and become a hermit and an anchorite and so on.
And what's Heidegger's perspective and understanding of our thinking capacity, and are there different ways to think? How does that relate to the ability to attach or give meaning consciously? Is that something we can consciously do? Is that an automatism? What is his perspective or insights on thinking?
The answer is yes to those questions. He mostly, especially in his later life, uh, always stressed we've got to be, we're not thinking. Denken became his sort of mantra. But what he means by thinking is not logical, conclusive. That's objective thinking, which is very, very important. When you're dealing with your health, when you're dealing with the car that you drive, you want to have that kind of scientific, technical information. What he meant by Denken was somehow meditating. Besinnung is a phrase he used, sort of meditating upon what you use the word nature, but our nature is becoming. So it's actually thinking is not just observing and talking about, it's actually appropriating that becoming. He quotes in Being in Time a famous Greek phrase by the poet Pindar, genoi hoios esimathon, become what you already are. Now, if you think your essence is static and you're a logical being, period, or a scientific being or an objective, that's what you'll become. But Heidegger thinks, no, 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 we're so much more. And you've and I have been trying to articulate that. What would it mean to appropriate that? Well, I think he gives us the right question. Appropriate that. Well, thank you, Mr. Heidegger. Now what do I do? He doesn't say. There was a famous, it was Karl Löwit, one of his students who was, frankly, a leftist, who said, we used to come out of his lectures so inspired, so eager to resolve ourselves, Entschlossenheit, I'll be resolute. But we didn't know if that meant we should read the pre-Socratics or join the Nazi party. So Heidegger doesn't tell you that. Think. Well, thank you, Mr. Heidegger.
Is that a reference to taking self-responsibility again by not telling you what to do? But
well, yeah. What Heidegger says, and it's not much in Being in Time, is it's almost too simplistic. He says there's two ways that you can give advice, if you will, or encourage or lead somebody. You can step in for them, the way we do for our children. No, 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 you don't do it that way, son or daughter. You do it this way, and then they imitate you. The other is to step ahead of them, clearing the way for their responsibility to fill that space, right? But again, that's a nice phrase, isn't it? Step ahead of people, give them possibilities. But that's very formal. It doesn't tell you when you should say you should not do this or that. Murder, for example. Gambia has just reinstituted the possibility of genital cutting. There was a ban on that for some years. But as of last week or last couple of days, they've done away with that ban. Whoa. Do we have an opinion about whether that's good or bad? How do we step into that possibility that Heidegger opens up for us so that we don't do something that's harmful?
Very interesting.
Yeah, well, we're approaching the end.
I know.
Heidegger
Yes.
gives us a lot of formal protreptics, exhortations, if you will, and also information about where we're coming from in order to make decisions. But finally, as you just now said, he steps aside and says, the decision is yours. Of course it's mine, but could I get a little help?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that has been so insightful. As a last question, what do you think differentiates your perspective from others about Heidegger?
There are many different Heidegger readings, if you will, Heidegger interpretations. When I do my own work, I try to be comprehensive. There are 102 volumes and more to come of Heidegger's Gesamtausgabe. Can one read them all and know them all? A lot of them are very repetitious. Okay, comprehensive rather than just picking up one little part of it and running with that. The Indian story about the blind men and the elephant. One grabs the tail and says, well, that's what an elephant is. It's this ropey thing. Someone grabs the leg and says, no, it's more like a tree, because he's grabbing the leg, etc. But to step back and see the whole of Heidegger is, I think, important, and to be critically true to it. One of the differences is linguistic, by, as we discussed, taking Heidegger's terminology and reinserting it out of the metaphysical framework into the phenomenological one, thereby changing things. And secondly, I'm going back to what Heidegger told me in 71, not only doing the phenomenological meaning reading of his terms, but also the kinetic movement reading of his terms, right? That's one of the big differentiations. A third would be just this word being, which has become catnip for Heideggerians. They get all excited about the word being, but when you ask them what it means, well, we're not so sure. It could mean many things. No, Heidegger has a very clear sense of what he means by being, often obfuscated by his language, to be sure. But he once said there are people who like to get rapturous about philosophy. I much rather be restrained and just kind of understand what the man is saying, and then be critical and look beyond it. So I think the linguistic issue, the introduction of phenomenology and movement into the discourse, is one of the things that differentiates my readings from some, but not from all. There are many scholars that I find myself absolutely in agreement with. So,
Thank you so much. So my conclusion is that Heidegger doesn't give any answer, but just raises big questions.
And if one wanted to start, my conclusion would be, if you want to start to read Heidegger, do not start with Being and Time, that 400-page, very thick and difficult things. He has a little essay. In fact, Simon, I could send it to you. I've done a retranslation of it, called What is Metaphysics, which is precisely about facing the music, I called it, facing one's mortality and being thrown back into the world of meaning. That would be a place to start. It's in translation everywhere. It's in German, in Gesamtausgabe, Volume 9, Wegmarken.
Excellent. So if that's also available online, we can link to it in the description so that our audience also can look it up.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Simon. And I welcome any critiques from your listeners. I'm sure there will be lots of them. They can email me at tsheehan@Stanford. It's a very simple email address, my first initial and my name at stanford.edu. I'd be happy to dialogue with them.
Amazing. Yes, of course. We will love to add this also to the description. And I will also reference the book or any other of your books, so that our listeners can learn about your work and your perspectives, for example, on Heidegger. I thank you very much for taking the time to be here and sharing from your wisdom. That's greatly appreciated.
You're welcome, and good luck with your podcast, and the best to all of your listeners.
Thank you so much. Yeah, all the best. And also thank you to all of our listeners for being here. Stay true to yourself and see you next time.